Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. After watching Princess Kaiveza and the world first kill on Mythic, I wanted to talk about some of the really crazy and insane things that they're doing for healing, because usually these are experiences that nobody else really has in the world. Almost all the time, whenever you're healing in a raid, it's about, okay, what's the most optimal way to do as much healing as I can? You might open the spreadsheet, assign some cooldowns, and that's kind of how you separate everything, and then you just go and blast. But Nexus Princess Kaiveza was so insanely different that I gotta make a video onto it. So at the very beginning, yes, we know Prez is OP, and then you're going to stack 2 Preservation Evokers, but because the healing profile of Kaiveza is so different between 2 phases, Preservation Evoker is actually pretty awful in the intermission phase, and so they make up for it in a variety of different ways. So Preservation with Flame Shaper, of course, has the Engulf ability that when you use this cast, it's going to consume flame, which explodes for healing to everybody around them, which is insanely powerful when the Rift detonation on Princess Kaiveza is sucking in players and everyone is perfectly pixel stacked. When everyone's spread out in the intermission phase, however, the other 2 healers are really able to properly shine. As a result, what you are doing is you're building all of the healers in the composition to play into their healing profile strengths really heavily, and it's not just about utility anymore. This is an area that we really talked very heavily about leading up to the Race to World First and tier lists and my own tier lists about the importance of utility and the importance of damage reduction. But actually, this is more similar to what DPS are brought to the table, where they want certain damage for certain boss fights. They want certain damage profiles for what the encounters bring to the table. And so the Preservation Evokers are dominating in their healing when it comes to all the players being stacked. There's also the Queensbane debuff, where we see Ciri even changing the color of his raid frames with the Cell add-on, changing the color of his raid frames to orange, and every time they go out in the Phantom Blade phase, he is responsible for babysitting them. Early on in the encounter, they were ending up running with a Holy Paladin throughout the fight, which was pretty standard, something we expect, but the type of output and the healing profile that Holy Paladin brought really wasn't meeting a lot of their needs. The Sun's Avatar lines, the bursty lines that would spread between the Paladin who had wings up and the target for Dawnlight, are insanely good when everybody's pixel stacked all together. But that's also the area that Flame Shaper Evoker really shines in, and so there's actually sort of an overlap in value there, that just because Paladin feels really good at that point, there's a spec that's so much better than them at healing that point that you already have 2 of those healers dominating it, and then you need 2 different healing profiles for the healers to make up for it. The other thing is that Devo Aura can be brought by Ret Paladins, and Aura Mastery, while it's a very good defensive, you can absolutely quantify how much value that brings to the table. And so if the healing that is done, especially in the intermission phase, is outpacing and exceeding the damage reduction value that Aura Mastery brings to you, well, it's better to bring another healer to the table and actually change some of the things up. Queensbane, notably, like I mentioned, is where we're having Ciri just change his raid frames to orange, blast a ton of healing into the allies, but it's also a big reason why Ciri was running the Apotheosis talent. A lot of times he was popping in the intermission phases to make sure he's dropping extra spot healing into people who had the Regicide lines, but it's also just a good tool in general to amplify your spot healing, your single target healing, with the Lightweaver talent just being a major focus for Holy Priest in this incoming season. While there's a lot of balance with how Holy Priest's end talents are working, there's a lot of balance in the terms of their overall output. If you have 2 different builds that might be doing the same healing between Lightweaver and like a Prayer of Healing or Sanctify focus build, well, Lightweaver is directly leading to keeping people alive, especially because the Reaper debuff on Nexus Princess instantly kills players when they drop sub 10%. And so the more effective profile of healing, once again, is actually dominating in the environment. In the intermission phase, especially the first intermission phase, you really get to see the difference in terms of total output for the healers. You see the first phase coming in with Preservation Evokers absolutely crushing the meters, of course, after the first phase ends. Intermission comes around, and really the only things that the Preservation Evokers are doing are hitting rewind, getting their Empower abilities utilized at some point into the intermission phase, trying to toss around some echoes, get their reversions on cooldown, but they're not expending their engulfs, for example. They're not expending large amounts of mana or anything along those lines. They're hitting their Empower abilities when they can, trying to get a cleave that they can, using their cooldowns and rewind to help with some of the output, but letting especially the Resto Shaman, but even the Holy Priest as well, carry the brunt of the output in these intermission phases. There were a couple times as well where both the Holy Priest and Resto Shaman, I think in the second intermission, did about 100 million healing each, compared to the 40 or 60 or million healing out of the Preservation Evokers. But also, keep in mind the Preservation Evokers were alternating their rewinds as well for that intermission phase, so not as much of it was coming from just directly their abilities or their rotational abilities to make up for it. Resto Shaman's a pretty insane choice, and ironically enough, since you always think of Shaman being amazing when players are stacked, ironically enough, it's crazy good for the spread environment that was going on in the intermission phases, because they could pop Ascendance, Ancestral Guidance, have Cloudburst Totem at the ready to burst a huge amount of output. And while you might be thinking that Totemic Resto Shaman is really rough on mana and it's a pain and it's difficult to manage, all that stuff, you're having a lot of players in the raid with the Sureki Insignia neck, which gives mana back. But also, you're going in with very specific roles in mind for everybody in the group. And so a number of times in the encounter, you're actually having the Holy Priest and Resto Shaman not needing to expend a ton of mana to maintain healing during those rift explosions that are dealing crazy amounts of damage. When you can literally watch like Scott's POV throughout this video and you could see all of the raid frames like bursting up all together all at once, because that's just how powerful Consumed Flame is for the Flame Shaper Evokers. It's just a sign that you can allow very strict healing cooldowns and very strict healing assignments that people kind of talk about in like the classic environment of like back in the day. Oh, like I would heal groups 1 and 2 and this person would heal groups in 3 and 4. We're not in that sort of odd positional requirement for how you're healing the frames, but we're actually having hard assignments for what type of healing is getting covered by one healer and what type of healing is getting covered by another. Of course, everyone's trying to contribute. You know, Golden Hour has good value on the people using Queensbane, of course, and if possible, they're trying to make sure they expend it. You know, there was some good Lifebind ramps with Emerald Communion, as we expect, but the majority of the sort of like rotational abilities that you're really expecting onto this one are the areas where they're bringing in a diverse composition to make up for it from those healing requirements. There were even moments where the Flame Shaper Evokers did not have extra engulf uses, and they leaned on the Resto Shaman once again to drop their Spirit Link Totem, and since everybody's health was getting regularly equalized, the Evokers were able to take advantage of Dream Flight, and they stacked like Dream Flights together, so they would just both be pulsing huge amounts of healing through the raid as health was getting redirected onto the way. It's a really odd and sort of like unique way that they've set up healing throughout the encounter, and a big boon for the comp is that you have a lot of tank externals available to the team. Queensbane debuff, like I mentioned, dealt absurd amounts of healing to the point that they would have frame highlights on everybody to call for externals like Time Dilation, which would give the stagger effect to their allies and make it so that they can have a bit more breathing room to provide additional amounts of healing. And so even having a couple extra seconds to respond to that damage, I mean, Renewing Blaze like super hard carried all of the Evokers like personal output, their personal healing to themselves, because once you had that going and rolling from the Queensbane dot, as long as you survived it, you would basically just allow that to fully heal all of it. But keep in mind, you could also be casting, thanks to the Life Cinders talent for Flame Shaper, if an Evoker, Preservation Evoker, got targeted, they could also cast a half-strength Renewing Blaze on somebody else that was getting targeted at the same time, meaning that their direct healing, their direct focused healing through their globals themselves wasn't focused on the Queensbane output, but their utility with Time Dilation, with the Renewing Blaze they could provide to other people, was outstanding for dealing with these mechanics in general. And so it's a really crazy way that they've set up the healing throughout this encounter, and it's very unique that we don't actually get a chance to like unveil and sort of look at, because as players get more health, as there's more stamina, you get a wider diversity of compositions that are allowed as a result. And when there's a greater amount of stamina, the damage itself is not forcing you to run healers only for their output and only for their healing profile and have these super hard assignments available to you. So it's something that's really only represented in the Race to World First, and it's something that I found to be like one of the coolest things we've seen out of the race thus far. Oh, actually, before I forget, Holy Priest with the Afterlife talent, which allows you to go into angel form and get a free res, was actually something they didn't utilize on the fight. What happens if like Ciri ended up dying, you go into angel form, and then you can cast a res that doesn't incur a battle res timer onto this at all? This is a really cool bit of utility that you could flex into if you needed to, but a lot of it was actually for the increased range at the end of the fight, so that Ciri could end up dying, sitting in angel form, and then reach everybody in the raid. Because when they had the big circle around the room of dealing with the intermission phase, you would often put like mages in the furthest back section, and it would be very difficult for them to get reached through normal healing mechanics. You know, you're going to have really long jumps out of like your chain heals, for example, as a shaman, allowing you to sort of hit everybody in the raid or most of the priority targets in the raid with its smart healing, but also having the afterlife effect used for the increased range and not for the actual res effect was insanely powerful for helping the team survive at the very end of the encounter and letting him basically just like burn his mana bar down like crazy in order to survive. They also took advantage of some spatial paradox. There were some moments where Ciri got them themselves just to make sure there was some additional healing on hand. So there was a lot of very good cast on the move and like the entire kit of healers and the DPS evokers on hand to be able to help them out as well. But those are some of my thoughts. Let me know if there are any other questions you guys had for like Race to World First Healing or anything along those lines. This is just something I noticed and was like so excited to see when Nexus Princess Kai'Veza was going on. Huge thank you to our patrons for making all this content possible. And if you guys haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.